this is the second talk on the Maddie Colloquium program, and we've spread this over a couple of weeks, and it's my pleasure to convene us, bring us together today. This is a fantastic way to wrap up the week. We'll hear from Gary Hatfield. I want to say a couple of things up front. First, as Jeremy mentioned last time, Penn's role in the field has been exciting, and it's one of the things that excited me about coming to UC Irvine to begin with. Penn means something important to us here, institutionally too, and pragmatically. For the last 20 years or so, there's been a trajectory that led to the Department of Logic and Philosophy of Science. And Penn was a prime mover in that. Without Penn's dedication to us and what we study together and what we think about together, logic and philosophy of science would not exist at UC Irvine. And that's something that's a part of her legacy, and it's something that we all enjoy. So it's my special pleasure to be part of the festivities celebrating Penn and her work, both of pragmatic nature, a local pragmatic nature, and then a global conceptual nature. Today, we're going to hear from Gary Hatfield, University of Pennsylvania. The title of his talk is The Corporeal Idea of Distance, Information Processing or Mechanical Correlation. Gary is Sabert Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. And he does work both in the history of philosophy, but also and especially in topics like the evolution of brain, mind, culture, and visual perception and cognition. And so given the trajectory that Penn's followed in her research interests over the last couple of decades, I can think of no one who better meshes with the collection of issues. Gary, welcome and thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be involved in the Penn-Maddie Colloquium. I think I met her first in 2011 when I was there to give a talk that was sponsored by both of the two departments, which was a talk on Russell and on perception and the geometry of space. And we had a lively discussion, and then in looking through my emails, we had a long correspondence about various things having to do with perception and which things to read for what and things like that. And then Penn was instrumental in inviting me to apply to come and visit UCI in 2016. So about 5 years, well, 4.5 years ago or so, when I gave a couple more talks, one on appearance views in perception and one on Descartes on attention. And then there was a pleasant mix of attending reading groups and having individual meetings after that, and a lot of discussion. And I also had a line of work on Descartes that sort of merged with the geometry visual space interest from the later periods, having to do with Descartes' natural geometry. And Penn gave me some criticisms on that paper, I think, while it was still in draft before it was published. As my memory, which certainly helped improve the paper. So I thought I have been recently now working on extensions of that line. And so I thought a nice way to mesh with Penn's interest in perception and the history of theories of perception. So she's, when you sort of look at one of her syllabi in the history of theory of perception, it just almost includes everybody that I would think would be important to include, from Descartes to Gibson, Marr, and so forth. So I thought this would be a good way to honor her, was to see if I could convince her that I'd made a little further progress in thinking about some of these issues. As I understand it, Penn was interested in perception a long time ago, and then got interested again more recently, maybe in the last 10 or 15 years. I think I remember her telling me that one time. So I'm now going to share a screen, and then I'm going to read the paper, and there'll be these illustrations. When you deal with physiology and vision, you basically need images, or at least I do. All right, so you guys are the Brady Bunch over here on the side, and here I am. So when Descartes published his Dioptriques in 1637, he sought to further, and partly to reformulate, an established mathematical discipline, that of optics. The discipline of optics investigated sight itself, encompassing what we would today call physical, physiological, and psychological aspects. Topics covered in the Dioptriques included the physical basis of light and color in a particulate medium, mirror reflection, the sine law of refraction, the post-Keplerian anatomy of the eye and optic nerve, the operation of the senses, and specifically the sense of vision, including the perception of light, color, location, distance, size, and shape, visual illusions, after images, the theory of lenses, as also applied to eyeglasses, telescopes, and designs for simple and compound microscopes, and plans for a lens cutting machine. I'm focusing here on Descartes' account of distance perception. In the sixth discourse of the Dioptriques, he described 4 means of perceiving distance. 2 of these had been mentioned in pre-Keplerian optical tradition. The first is the distinctness of detail and strength of light and color, which fall off with distance. Elsewhere called atmospheric perspective, this manner for rendering distance had been noted before in painting manuals, such as Alberti's on painting of 1547, but I think you can also find it all the way back in Ptolemy. The second was the ability to imagine or judge the distance of objects of known size through their visual angles. Visual angles are lines from the outline shape of an object, usually from top and bottom of the object and meeting in the center of the eye. So this means of judging or imagining distance was to have the angle, know the size of the object, and then work backwards to how far it must be away. So this link between known size and distance had been described by Ibn al-Haytham shortly into the beginning of the 2nd millennium. But before mentioning these, Descartes first discussed 2 newly described means for what he called seeing, perceiving, or being acquainted with distance. So he didn't say that we see distance. These are the accommodation of the eye for the various distances so as to keep the retinal image in focus. Illustrated here is a changing of the shape of the lens. So on the left there, you can see that I is flatter than F. And that would be for far distance, and F would be for closer, nearer distance. So you've got the accommodation of the lens and the triangle of convergence formed by the inter-ocular distance and the convergence of the lines of sight on a single fixation point at various distances. The first became available in optical theory only with the Keplerian anatomy of lens and retinal screen, and was first tied to distance perception by Descartes, at least so far as I know. The second was available before, but to my knowledge, I mean, anyone could have talked about the turning of the eyes, going all the way back to Euclid and Ptolemy, but I think it wasn't theorized until Kepler drew attention to it. And Descartes devoted considerable discussion to these means of perceiving distance, accommodation and convergence, in the Dioptriques. And he elaborated on these themes even more in 2 distinct passages from the Treatise on Man, work posthumously published in 1664. The treatise is a major work which presents Descartes' physiological conceptions focused primarily on the senses, bodily motion, associated brain processes. Of these two novel conceptions, the triangle of convergence has received more attention, especially in the Anglophone literature and in connection with Descartes' invocation of a, quotes, natural geometry. This special attention may stem from the Irish philosopher George Berkeley having included in his widely read essay Towards a New Theory of Vision, a, quotes, refutation of what he calls, quote, Descartes' innate geometry, interpreted as involving mental calculation of distance by angle side angle. And so Berkeley famously opined, but those lines and angles, by means whereof some men pretend to explain the perception of distance, are themselves not at all perceived, nor are they in truth ever thought of by those unskillful in optics. And so the lines and angles would be that line of distance between the two eyes L and M, and then the angles when the eyes are fixated on N, and then if N came closer, the angle would be different. If N went further away, then the angle would be less acute. And so those are the lines and angles that Berkeley says no one really thinks of when they perceive distance. Berkeley interpreted Descartes' natural geometry as a kind of mental calculation. This interpretive line, perhaps with the calculations rendered rapid and unnoticed, is the most popular, accepted by Margaret Wilson, Nancy Mall, Michel Fouchon, Stephen Gaukroger, and most recently by Delphine Bellis. Earlier, Alquier rejected calculation in favor of what he called a mysterious institution of nature, which renders the natural geometry, quotes, instinctive. And mysterious is also a quote from him. He was commenting on a passage from the Treatise on Man that also speaks of a natural geometry. In interpretive discussions, this passage, about halfway through the treatise, is paired with that in the Dioptrics. Recall that the treatise envisions the mechanism of a human body without a mind. It describes a kind of Cartesian zombie, which, however, carries out many sense-based behaviors that are appropriate to local circumstances. And I should say that it's not a zombie as on The Walking Dead, because they actually still have sentience of a certain rudimentary kind. It's a philosophical zombie. I mean, these only exist in philosophy circles, where you imagine a fully formed body that functions and behaves, but there's no there. There's no consciousness. The fact that the treatise describes mechanisms that can operate independently of the mind provides, I suggest, a framework for characterizing the natural geometry as fully instantiated by bodily mechanisms. So the first section is natural geometry in the Dioptrics and the treatise, and I'm going to be making something of the relationship between the two works. In these passages that I've been mentioning, Descartes compares the triangle of convergence with the use of two sticks by a blind man to perceive the distance to their point of intersection. As illustrated in diagrams from the treatise, he makes a strong comparison, and the quotation here is at the bottom of the PowerPoint slide. Notice also that if the two hands FG, and so see if I can just point it. So here you've got the two hands F and G. If the two hands FG hold a stick, I and H, and you can see I and H are right along here. So I and H, and these are marking the two sticks. Each hold a stick I and H with which they touch object K, so that's that little stump. Although the soul is otherwise ignorant of the length of the sticks, nevertheless, because it knows the distance between the 2 points F and G and the size of the angles FGH and GFI, it will be able to perceive, as if by a natural geometry, where the object K is. And quite in the same way, if the two eyes L and M, and so you can see that on the right there, are turned toward object N, the magnitude of the line LM and the two angles LMN and MLN will make the perceiver, will make it, the soul, perceive where point N is. So this passage invokes the soul. This passage from the treatise in a work that is about the body to which the soul will later be conjoined. A natural reading, I think, of the first part of the passage is that the soul of the blind man knows the location of his hands and the orientation of the sticks, and through a mental calculation perceives the location of K, including its distance. The description of the visual case is less suggestive of mental operations. There, the distance between the eyes and the angles of the axes together, quote, make the soul perceive the distance, but we're not told how. I want to suggest that the brain provides a mechanism that yields a material state of the nervous system, which co-varies with the distance to object N. But we need to delve further into both texts to get to this reading. So the Dioptrics also treats the blind man first in connection with knowing the locations of things relative to the body. In vision, we know the locations or directions of things because the state of the nerves that control the direction of the eyes, described as, quote, the position of the tiny parts of the brain where the nerves originate, are correlated with perceived directions. So these changes in the internal part of the brain are correlated with perceived directions from the body. Changes in these brain states alter the position of the limbs, in this case, the hands, and these same brain states, in accordance with, quote, an institution of nature, which I take to be a kind of psychophysiological law, cause the mind to perceive directions from the body or from its limbs. So you've got the very state that's controlling the direction, say, of the hands. That very state at the same time has an effect upon the mind and causes a perception of that very direction that the hand is. And it's not because the mind sort of is looking at the mechanism of the brain and figuring out, okay, so that rather it's that you've got the mechanism of the brain, which affects the hands pointing with the sticks, and then it's been set up that there's a psychophysiological law according which the sequence of varying states in the brain that cause the hands to come closer together or point closer together or point further away, that very sequence of states then causes, by basically an arbitrary institution between the brain states and the mind, arbitrary in a certain sense, causes the mind then to perceive that direction. The example bears similarities with what this example bears similarities with what was called natural geometry in the treatise, a phrase used later in the Dioptrics, but not used here. In this passage, the brain is in control. Depending on differences in the small parts of the brain, the limbs are oriented in one direction or another, and the soul perceives that direction and can direct its attention along the line defined from the limb outward. This account of the perception of direction may generate a problem for the mental calculation view. For Descartes says that to attend to these directional lines, the blind man, quote, does not need to know or to consider at all the location of his two hands. So you would think if you're doing calculation based on the angles that you would need to know the locations of the hands and their orientation. It says here you don't. And actually Claire understands this passage in a similar way, that you don't need to do it, or the passage in the treatise that corresponds to this, that you don't need to know the location mentally. He thus seems to get the orientation of A and C as hands, the intersection of the lines E, and the directions of B and D for free, or by having them be incorporated somehow in the mechanism in a way where they're causally relevant but not mentally represented. So this is it. They get them this because the mechanism then ends with a psychophysiological correlation between controlling brain state and experience direction. To get the location of E, the blind man would of course need to perceive its direction and distance from the body. So if you're going to actually perceive E, then you have to perceive its direction and distance if you're going to perceive E's location. But Descartes seems to be saying that this can be done without perceiving the position and orientation of the two hands. Indeed, below I shall introduce a mechanism which explains how the position, including the distance of E, could be perceived without perceiving or being mentally aware of the segments AE and CE, as seen on the figure on the left there. The Dioptrics, as mentioned, lists accommodation first among the means for perceiving distance. Descartes describes how, quote, a certain part of our brain, end quote, controls the focal properties of the eye. So this time it's controlling actually the shape of the lens. This brain state, therefore, co-varies with distance, and in accordance with an institution of nature, here again invoked, makes us see things at a specific distance. Here the Dioptric surpasses the account of accommodation from the middle of the treatise, where Descartes simply says, quote, that the soul will be able to know the distance by means of this accommodation. The Dioptrics affirms that brain states control accommodation, that they co-vary with distance, and that they are instituted by nature to make us see distance. Presumably, no feeling of the tension in the ocular muscles is involved. Rather, the mechanical brain processes process that adjusts accommodation for a given distance at the same time makes the soul perceive a fixated object at that distance. In the Dioptrics, Descartes again applies the phrase natural geometry to the blind man and to the triangle of convergence. And so this is this long passage here, which I'm going to read out. He says in the second place, so now he's done accommodation, now he's coming to convergence. In the second place, we perceive distance by the relation of the eyes to one another. Our blind man holding the two sticks A, E, and CE, whose length I assume he doesn't know, and knowing only the distance between his two hands A and C and the size of the angles AC and CAE, can perceive from this knowledge as if by a natural geometry where the point E is. Now you might notice there that he's contradicting himself from the previous page where he says he doesn't need to know the position of the hands. And so we've got an interpretive paradox. What do? Do we go with one passage or the other? Well, I think in the end, the much fuller description of these processes in the treatise should trump this interpretive difference here and lead us to resolve on a particular interpretation of these passages where he doesn't need to know the position of the hands. So this passage offers some, well, no, point E is I need to finish the passage. And similarly, when our two eyes A, B, and so he doesn't label these as A and B, but treat the left eye as A and the right eye as B. When our two eyes A and B are turned toward point X, so X is in the middle at the top, the length of line AB, so that would be a line between the two. And it's interesting, Descartes is calling for this in the text, but even though he was in charge of the diagrams for the dioptrics, he didn't include a diagram with A and B in it. When our two eyes AB are turned toward point X, the length of line AB and the size of the two angles XAB and XBA enable us to know where the point X is. So this passage offers some comfort to the mental calculation reading. It seems that we must know the inter-ocular separation and the angle of rotation of the eyeballs in order to perceive the location, direction, and distance of objects, presumably by rapid and habitual calculation. I want to return to the details of brain mechanisms that control accommodation and convergence as described more extensively toward the end of the treatise. Before doing so, I consider Gaukroger's interpretation of the natural geometry, which reads Descartes as a kind of information processing theorist. So the next section here is called Gaukroger on mental representation. In interpreting Descartes on these topics, Gaukroger has two aims. First, to distinguish animal cognition from human mentality. And second, to find that animals and humans share a physiology of information processing, sentience, and neural representations. So Gaukroger rejects the animal-machine interpretation of Descartes' treatise and other works, according to which animals and the soulless body of the treatise are purely mechanical devices, merely non-sentient machines. As I say, he rejects that interpretation. For the record, I accept that interpretation, but I just want to follow Gaukroger here for now. So he introduces a distinction between reflective judgment, which is specific to humans, and mental representation and computation in the nervous system shared with animals. The latter capacities for vision, and what should go back here, latter capacities for vision include, and this is at the top there, visual awareness in which the perceiver has a mental representation of the object or state of affairs that caused the visual stimulus in the first place. And so he's saying that this capacity is shared between human and non-human animals. Animals and humans possess sentient representations, but animals lack consciousness gained by reflection and judgment. So that's why he wants this distinction between reflective judgment and other sorts of mental processes. In discussing the cue of accommodation, Gaukroger repeats the phrase from the middle of the treatise that the change in the lens makes the soul, quote, able to know the distance, end quote, remarking that Descartes has nothing more to say about how this occurs. Well, in fact, we've already seen that Descartes says more in the Dioptrics. With Convergence, Gaukroger elaborates somewhat, telling us that Descartes attributes to the animal and human visual systems the innate ability to calculate the distance using natural geometry and perhaps trigonometry on the triangle of convergence. To support his attribution of representations to animals, Gaukroger quotes a passage from the treatise and offers an argument. In the passage, and this is number 2 on the slide there, the second point, Descartes says that the figures imprinted on the sense organs and in the brain, so he had been talking about patterns that match the external object being imprinted on the sense organs in the brain. Of those figures, quote, only those traced in the spirits on the surface of gland H should be taken as the forms or images which, when united to the machine, the rational soul will consider directly when it imagines some object or senses it, end quote. And so gland H is the pineal gland. As Annie Bitpol-Hesperius has shown the origins of that designation. The quoted passage does not speak of representations, but Gaukroger says that it posits pineal gland representations. Applying the passage to animals, Gaukroger argues, and this is the third point on the slide, quote, this indicates that there are representations on the pineal gland of the automaton. It is in fact difficult to see how they could not have representations of the world if we are to talk about visual cognition. And it makes no sense to talk about having representations, but not being aware of the content of these representations, end quote. His argument essentially invokes the principle of charity in interpreting Descartes so as to make intuitive sense today. Gaukroger further explains his attribution of sentience to Descartes' mindless machines. It is because, and this is number 4, sentient beings are able to process information. They are able to interpret stimuli. And he seems to think it's not only that it's sufficient that they be sentient that they do this, but that it's necessary. Gaukroger has, in effect, assimilated Descartes to present-day information processing account without going into detail regarding how the information is processed. Now, unfortunately for Gaukroger, present-day cognitive accounts of vision have little trouble ascribing informational content to subpersonal psychological states that without requiring that the perceiver be aware of such content. Accounts of the basis of accommodation and convergence as optical cues or the more recently discovered binocular disparity or the response to optic flow fields do not require the perceiver to be conscious either of the processes involved or of the complex structure of optical stimulation. Rather, at least, some theorists posit that neural mechanisms respond to binocular disparity or ocular flow fields, yielding micro-representational states that are combined to produce personal level perceptual experience, in this case, of visual depth or the motion of the perceiver. And then I have a footnote here to note that not everyone agrees. So the Gibsonians, for instance, wouldn't want to talk about representations, although they'd be happy to talk about the perceptual experience at a personal level. And then there are dynamic process theorists who don't want to have representations. And then there are other dynamic process theorists who do want to have representations. But in both classical cognitive science and in more recent cognitive science, there are at least enough people saying they're happy with subpersonal micro representations that I think I can safely invoke it. It is unclear that non-conscious perceptual representations make no sense. at least according to this practice of science. In fact, this notion of non-conscious representation needn't be fatal to Gaukroger's endeavor to attribute cognitive processes to Descartes' automata. Perhaps we should simply attribute representations with informational content to the bodily states of the automata, along with unconscious calculations carried out by brain mechanisms. Indeed, Descartes does not directly ascribe sentience to his machines in the treatise, but compares them to mechanical clocks or to hydraulic automata in garden displays. Whether Gaukroger has good grounds for attributing sentience or even non-conscious calculative information processing in a quasi-Cartesian account of perception of distance remains to be seen. So next section is Descartes' visual physiology. Toward the end of the treatise, Descartes envisions a remarkable system that incorporates variations in accommodation and convergence into a single system with a brain state that co-varies with these bodily states and so with distance. This extended passage gives Descartes' fullest description of the physiology of accommodation and the triangle of convergence, and provides an interpretive framework for understanding the other discussions. Although Descartes mentions a certain gland in the dioptrics, which is the pineal gland, he does not describe how the gland is integrated into vision in the dioptrics. In the treatise, he introduces the gland early on as the source of animal spirits that flow into an interior brain cavity. These spirits induce muscle contraction, and their patterns of flow are partly controlled by processes involving the sense organs and nerves. But Descartes didn't integrate the role of the gland into the discussion of accommodation and convergence found mid-treatise, so these passages that I've read out before. So there's not really integration of the gland in those passages. This integration occurs toward the end of the work in a section that Clercellier entitled, quote, on the structure of the brain of this machine and how the spirits are distributed there so as to cause its movements and its sensations, end quote, and it would cause the sensations in the indent that the machine has been ensouled, of course. In these passages, in the latter part of the treatise, Descartes elaborates his sensory motor loop, in which what happens at the sense organs can control the movements of the machine. The loop occurs in a central brain cavity that depends on a bodily system of larger scope. So Descartes envisions the body as a hydraulic automaton. So he makes the clock metaphor every now and then, but the real mechanics is that of a hydraulic automaton, such as he might have seen at various gardens that had moving figures driven by water power. The heart acts like a boiler. So you can see the heart here over on the side. It acts like a boiler. He thinks the blood comes in there and there's a rapid chemical process that makes the blood expand. So then that gives some kind of flowing material through the artery. And so this is the blood which moves through the arteries. And you can see here, here's the heart, and then here you've got an artery going to the brain and the larger artery going down to the body. So this blood goes up to the brain, where the most subtle and lively particles are filtered out and then produced and then proceed to the pineal gland. So you can see here would be the pineal gland right here, and then here's the central cavity of the brain. You can also see the central cavity of the brain here with the pineal gland, and similarly in the bottom image. So the largest share of the spirits flow into nerve openings that line the central cavity. And that's what you see in the middle on the bottom. You see pineal gland spirits are radiating out from it to all these open tubules. And their nerves are in one characteristic of them are tubules. So they receive these animal spirits. Many of these tubules go to the muscles, which they cause to contract and inflate like sacs. And so here's a diagram that's allegedly based on one of the very few diagrams that was known to be by Descartes in illustrating this treatise And you can see here the animal spirits would go in these tubes and then come down so a nerve. So in this case, it would be the ocular motor nerve, would be this one right here, and come to the ocular muscles. And then they would go into this area here and inflate the muscle and make it contract. And so that's how muscle activity would work. The opening of tubes are largely controlled by sensory nerve filaments, which, as we'll see in a moment, that are within the tubules and which come from the sense organs, such as the eye. The figure labeled 53 here provides an example of the loop, which shows the pineal flow, the control of it by the nerves, and the transmission of spirits to the muscles. It illustrates the triangle of convergence. In the text, Descartes tells that by purely mechanical means involving the flow of spirits, the senses are focused on point B and arrow ABC. So here's point B, and be arrow ABC, and the eyes are focused here. Now the point of focus is point B. The arrow casts its image onto the retina 135, and so you can see here the you can see here 135, which is just the casting of the arrow there. Then you get a corresponding pattern 246 in these tubules here, and so there are little filaments in the nerves, and they get jingled by the light. Then the nerves cause these tubes to open, and then animal spirits flow from the pineal gland rectilinearly to these tubes. And then they must also flow to muscles. Here, the muscle of the arm, but they should also be flowing to the muscles that control the eyes, because the eyes have to stay focused on B, and they do that by the oculomotor muscles. So in this way, the spatial structure of the object ABC, including its direction and its shape, is transferred to the surface of the pineal gland. In addition, the state of the gland causes spirits to flow from lowercase point B near the top. So there's lowercase point B near the top, to motor tubule 8. So that I've just showed you motor tubule 8 there, inducing the finger to point at B, without, of course, there yet being any mind in this machine. Descartes directly tells us that, quote, spirits leaving the same point, little b, by tending towards tubules 4, 4, and 8, simultaneously turn the two eyes and the right arm towards object D, end quote. The ocular muscles, which are not shown, are implicated in fixing the eyes on point B. I should mention that Descartes' manuscript text for the treatise called for images such as we have been studying, but provided only a few originals, one of which we have seen as redrawn in the 1664 edition, and that's on the top there at the right. Claude Clercellier edited the treatise and other works. He arranged for the drawings as specified by the text and received 2 sets from Gerard van Gutschoven, professor of anatomy at Louvain, and Louis de Laforge, a medical doctor and Cartesian enthusiast. He did not print both sets of drawings in full, but more often chose to use those of Gutschoven. Gutschoven's drawings are themselves interpretations of the text. Close study of the text has convinced me that he was a good interpreter. And in fact, the other paper that I'm working on now is Gutschoven as an interpreter of the text and the role that the diagrams play as an independent interpretation. But I thought for a wider audience in philosophy of science, it might be more interesting to think about the notion of sensory information as opposed to getting really into the weeds about the drawings as interpretation. So a case in point, Descartes doesn't describe the placement of the nerves in figure 53. So Gutschoven just had to draw them in a certain way. Now he had, for this part with the 135, 243, he had that diagram from the Dioptrics, which was already published under Descartes' supervision, which is down in the lower right. And this muscle nerve, we have to look and see if he put it where Vesalius would have said the nerves controlling the body are. We have to assume that he did, but we'll also see in another diagram in a minute that he put in the ocular motor nerve, and there he made Descartes' drawing, the drawing he did on behalf of Descartes, coincide with the accepted location of the what Galen and Vesalius called the second cranial nerve, which was the ocular motor nerve, now known as the third cranial nerve. So the drawing of the sheep's brain doesn't really fill in for the ocular motor nerves. That's at the lower right there. Only shows the optic nerves. Gottschalk drew on standard conceptions of gross anatomy to render those nerves, including in yet another diagram that we'll see in a minute, the motor nerves as specified by Galen, Vesalius, and other anatomical texts. In figure 53 that we see there on the left, the optic nerves, the motor nerve for the arm, and the pineal gland are shown with one instance of flowing animal spirits, but the brain, mass, and other nerves are not rendered. In another figure labeled 50, which is at the top left, the optic nerves and pineal gland are put in context of the brain mass. Pineal flow is filled out to show the correspondence between object, retinal pattern, brain tube pattern, and pineal pattern, the latter consisting of outflowing spirits. And then there's an inversion pattern here that we see that I can talk about if you like. In that other work I mentioned, I have a huge long footnote about that. In 53, the ocular motor nerves are not shown. The optic nerves are shown, but I'm sorry, in 53, the ocular motor nerves are not shown. Yeah. But these are shown in earlier figures. And I should say in 50, the ocular motor nerves are shown. So this is the ocular motor nerve here that comes over and goes on. It should be 50 there. And so we'll see that here it's cut off and the ocular motor muscles are not shown. But in this one, actually, it's not cut off. And it's shown that that nerve actually goes to the muscles of the eye. And that is actually in anatomical location, roughly coinciding to where Vesalius had drawn and other anatomists had drawn the ocular motor nerve. So continue with our examination of figure 53. Descartes now relates that the focusing of the two eyes on B when the arrow is at different distances is controlled by a physiological mechanism involving the lean of the pineal gland. And so you can see the pineal gland leaning down here in this figure 41. The gland is more upright for a farther distance to B. It leans forward for a closer distance. So here you see, here's B. If B came in closer, then the gland would lean forward. And that's what Descartes calls for in the text. And as we'll see in a minute, that's what Gottschalk produces. He tells us that the, quote, idea of distance consists in the lean of the gland, in this case, as it controls the position of the two eyes and the arm. The term idea here means, and this is important to note, a material state of the gland, not a mental state as in his later usage. And Descartes, in fact, notes in the appendix to the second objections, replies that he's changing the meaning of the term idea from a material pattern to a mental structure. But in this earlier work, idea of distance meant a purely corporeal state. And if it had any mental connotations at all, it would be what it caused in a mind, but not, it itself was not a mental state. He then extends this mechanism to the accommodation of the lens. Descartes asks us to compare two figures, so this is in the text, one with the arrow further away and one closer. So these are the two figures. In the former case, the lens is flattened. And so if you look here with the arrow further away, you can see there's the lens. It's a bit flattened compared to the lenses here, and you can measure this and find that, yeah, this is slightly more bulgy than the other. So if the object comes nearer, the lens is made thicker or accommodated for a nearer object. Putting the two cases together, the lean of the gland in controlling accommodation and convergence, so it's a single mechanism to control both, continuously covaries with distance, and so can, in an ensouled machine, cause the perception of distance. Descartes has, in effect, proposed a unified mechanism that yokes accommodation and convergence. As he makes clear in his description, a single corporeal idea can control several limbs and organs, such as the eyes, and direct them toward B. In an ensouled machine, this unified corporeal idea would cause a unified experience of the distance to the focal object B. Gottschalk has followed Descartes' specifications by rendering the two drawings in a way that integrates accommodation and convergence as involving changes in the rotation of the eyes and the thickness of the lens. He has made good on Descartes' specification of a single idea of distance involving multiple organs and a single controlling brain state. And you can see the way this works for the triangle of convergence and the lean just by looking at those green lines that show the focus on B, and then the other line showing what's going on with the pineal gland as the triangle gets smaller. So there's the two diagrams. You can see the convergence is different in the two cases, not only the accommodation and the lean, the pineal gland presumably is responsible for both the change in convergence and for the change in accommodation. In this mechanical system, there is no question of the soul being aware of lines and angles, as Berkeley charged, nor do the muscle actions that control accommodation and convergence yield muscular feelings of position, as Berkeley would also say on his own account. The pineal lean is the idea of distance because it directly covaries with distance. The muscle states and the changes in the triangle of convergence are merely a link in the chain. Descartes does not say that the lean of the gland is or is mediated by a corporeal idea of the state of the muscles or of the rotation of the eyes. Rather, the lean controls the muscles and so the direction of the eyes, and also serves directly as the corporeal idea of distance. So in the last section is Descartes' Visual Psychophysiology with and without pineal representations. So shall we say that the brain mechanism calculates or computes distance? This is not as far-fetched as it might seem. Descartes was aware of, indeed had invented, mechanical compasses that could provide trigonometric results, or even could, in a certain sense, solve the Delian problem of computing geometric proportions. I say in a certain sense because these mechanical things, of course, don't get you a precise solution. You have to treat them as ideal objects in order to get precise values. So Descartes made a compass like this to do solve the Delian problem. And if you were a carpenter trying to figure out, how long your piece of wood needed to be, you could use this thing to get it. He also trisected the angle with this. And again, so the mechanical thing is not strictly a proper demonstrative trisection, but it does. So these little bits here slide, H and G, and as you open this angle, then those slide down, and you get a trisection. This is a trigonometric, among other things, compass that Galileo sold, and he wrote a little pamphlet that went along with it. And so it's a brass instrument that he was selling in the first decade of the 17th century as a way to make some money. And you could use one arm of it on a theodolite sitting on a riverbank, and that would be then a vertical. And you could assume that the angle between the bottom of the theodolite and the river was a right angle if you're right on the edge of the river and the river was calm and flat. And so then you'd have, and the length of the theodolite, and then you use this to sight the other bank of the river, and then you'd be able to, by angle side angle, read off a trigonometric value off the scale. So these were sort of like kind of slide rules in a certain way. You could read off the trigonometric value and know the width of the river. So Descartes was aware of and indeed has invented some of these mechanical devices. So is that how he conceives this mechanism? Does he conceive it as a device that actually makes computations, or is he thinking of it in some other way? So I want to consider two options. One in which Descartes invokes non-conscious representations in the mindless animal machine. And so he does attribute information representational content to also these compasses, I guess. And one in which Descartes treats the mindless brain as merely producing states that covary with distance but do not represent it. The representation of distance then occurs in the minded human being via the institution of nature. Under the second option, non-human animals don't represent distance, even if states of their brains covary with distance. But both conceptions avoid Gauck-Rogers' claims about animal awareness. They also both interpret the institution of nature as a psychophysiological regularity established by God or nature. The psychophysiological rule is not so mysterious as Alquier had thought. At least won't be after we get done here, I hope. And on the first conception, we treat the lean of the pineal gland as embodying information about distance, and hence as itself representing various distances. Accordingly, the institution of nature operates by translating the distance information represented by the lean of the gland into a mental experience of distance. We might compare the brain mechanism that yields the information about distance to a mechanical compass that computes trigonometric values. The length of the base of the triangle of convergence and the side angles would have to be represented in order to enter into the calculation. In this case, we would interpret the mechanical compasses known to Descartes as calculating devices whose states have mathematical content. Manipulation of the devices alters the representational content in a proportionate manner. We would thereby open up attribution of representational content within the physical realm. Thus, we might regard drawings and paintings mentioned by Descartes in Discourse 4 of the Dioptrics as intrinsically representing, quote, forests, towns, people, and even battles and storms, end quote. The ovals and rhombuses also mentioned there in that passage from Discourse 4 would, as material entities and independent of human interpretation, intrinsically represent circles and squares in virtue of standing in a relation of perspective projection. This reading would treat drawings and paintings as themselves representations of scenes in virtue of a partial resemblance mediated by perspective. Descartes invites us to think of paintings as representing via resemblance in a letter to Regius from 1642. And here's the passage. Descartes wrote, "Suppose someone said that anyone can paint pictures as well as Apelles, because the pictures consist only of patterns of paint, and anyone can make all kinds of patterns with paint." To such a suggestion, we should have to reply that when we are talking about Apelles' pictures, we are not considering just a pattern of colors, but a pattern skillfully made to introduce a representation resembling reality, such as can be produced only by those very practiced in this art. End quote. Resemblance establishes representation here. To make this passage fit with Descartes' discussions of drawings and paintings in the Dioptrics, we would need to emphasize the imperfect resemblance that he mentioned in that part 4 of the Dioptrics, dictated by rules of perspective, which yield ovals and diamonds as representing circles and squares. And so he says, well, there's some resemblance there, but it's an imperfect resemblance. That's what he says in part 4 of the Dioptrics. And so I think, we could have this idea of partial resemblance. So on the second conception, the lean of the pineal gland covaries with distance, but does not intrinsically represent distances. In humans, the quote, institution of nature operates by generating representational and experiential mental content about distance in response to the lean. Animals, that is non-human animals, simply have a covarying brain state without representation. The length of the base of the triangle and the angular rotation of the eyes would be given as physical properties of the physiological mechanism that produces brain states that covary with distance. These values need not enter into the psychophysiological law linking pineal lean to perception of distance. The physical eyes are subparts of a system that yields covariation between distance and lean. But again, there's no need to have a direct psychophysiological connection to the amount of rotation of the eyes, to the distance between the eyes, and so forth. And those are physical factors and variables that enter in to creating this pineal lean state, which does directly covary with distance. So in comparing the brain mechanism that covaries with distance to a mechanical compass that yields trigonometric values, we would treat that device as a mechanism for instantiating various proportions and relations without thereby realizing the related mathematical content. The compasses are contentless bits of matter. Their user reads mathematical content from their states. The content exists only in the minded users. Accordingly, we would treat drawings and paintings as representing forests and people only in virtue of the response of someone viewing the depictions. The ovals and rhombuses would yield representations of circles and squares only as a result of their effects on minded viewers. On this interpretation, the perception of distance is much like that of color. Descartes indicates that colors in objects are nothing but ways in which surfaces reflect light. Different colored surfaces put different spins on light particles. Red surfaces put a more rapid spin on particles than do blue surfaces. This is from the Dioptrics. These various spins then affect the nerves and the retina, causing a certain character of motion in the optic nerve that depends on the speed of rotation, and the various motions of the nerves cause the mind to have a sensation of one color or another. Actually, the passages are both in the Dioptrics and in the Meteorology and also in the treatise. Presumably, the action of the nerve filaments on the interior cavity of the brain imparts one or another character to the flow of animal spirits corresponding to that nerve, and these differing pineal outflows cause one or another color sensation. Similarly, we can treat the pineal lean as being instituted by nature to yield the seeing of one or another distance. Although leaning is a spatial property, it is not the same as a perception of distance in a direction. There is an element of non-resemblance upon which, of course, Descartes insists. Just as the differing pineal flows do not represent color, but cause a representation of color in the mind, phenomenal color being on one interpretation a confused representation of an unknown surface property in objects. That's from the Principles. So too, the lean of the gland is not itself a representation of distance, but merely a mechanical covariant with distance, which then causes a sensory idea or sensory representation of distance in the mind. The institution of nature takes arbitrarily specified brain events, pulsing animal spirits for color, a leaning gland for distance, and yields phenomenal color and phenomenal distance in the mind. So which interpretation shall we choose? I favor the second interpretation, as it avoids introducing self-standing representations into mind-independent matter, instead restricting representations to the mind. For that reason, it seems more Cartesian to me, a desirable feature in an interpretation of Descartes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. I had to put down my pen because I was drawing diagrams that were starting to look like Cartesian diagrams. So let's take a 5-minute break, and we will reconvene for questions and discussion. So that will bring us to 4:07. Please feel free to tune back in at that point.
Yeah, the Beatles, the fucking dang don't sound cool. The fan. Yeah, well, if not them, then someone else cast. Bottom line, this is too important a time, brother, to be wasting a brilliant and creative mind on pandering. My point is, Brother Sam, that I am just one voice in this struggle. Just one. And Cassius, he's another who pushes us forward with his fists and with his words. And Jimmy pushes us forward with his fearlessness. The honorable life Muhammad says they hold on. Damn sure that. But you still obey them. They tell you to come out here and recruit Cassius to become a member of something. You don't even see Cassius do anything. Heck, he came to me for insight. He had questions. His passion for Islam comes from a pure place, man. Passion. You couldn't stop talking about how excited you were to come out with the broadcast. True, I was. I am. It's just that if we're being completely honest and all, I guess being a Muslim sounded like a much better idea before tonight. How did you have something on top of the world? I don't understand. You didn't actually think it was going to play tonight. Cash? Of course I do. I'm the best. I'm the greatest there ever will be. I'm just saying. No, I'm good. I'm just a little nervous. That's natural, ain't it? No. See, let me ask you something, Mr. Nolan. How is it helpful for Black people to run their businesses different than everyone else? Dumber than everyone else? No one's accused you of making bad business decisions, saying, I just want to have you forget what corporation is. I invested in the corporation. Have these proteges.
Okay, let's get back together here. Oh, wait, just a minute or two. I want to make sure that Penn has a chance to get back. Penn, greetings. So let's begin with a reply and thoughts from Penn, and then Penn, at any point along the way, if you have comments that you'd like to enter into the conversation, just let me know. But let's get started that way.
Okay. Gary, I'm not sure that I'm sort of up to date on this stuff as well as I should be. I've been thinking about other stuff, but I'm trying to remember back when you, in writings that I've read by you before, I thought that examples like the compasses were supposed to convince us that that the system could sort of compute a thing without having an algorithm represented, right?
So like a smart mechanism.
Sorry?
Right? Like a smart mechanism among the Gibsonians. So the planimeter, which.
Or you had the tension weigher or something like that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this was supposed to show how you could have the thing do the job without having any, as you might say, subpersonal representations.
That's right.
Okay.
So,
but now you're allowing that the compass might have these kinds of representations. Am I getting that?
well, we've got cross purposes here partly.
Okay.
Because there's my own position about these things.
All right.
And then there's the way Descartes has been interpreted by people, let's say, like Gaukroger.
Right.
And then there's the way in which I'm interpreting Descartes. And
but Gaukroger's got to be wrong. The mechanical man can't
have sentience.
No.
So then I was trying to do a friendly repair to Gaukroger. So let me go back. So you're saying, well, when you had the smart mechanism, you didn't want to put any internal representations in it. That's right.
Right.
And that's the way the Gibsonians would interpret it. And that's okay. Now, I think in the paper you're thinking of with the tensional adder, I don't believe I ruled out functional decomposition, which would decompose the representational function. You could have, as it were, a unitary relation. Some state varies in a certain way, and then the content varies in a certain way, and that's it. You don't have anything inside. But I also talked there about binocular stereopsis and micro representations.
Right.
And so my point was supposed to be that these representational values are assigned working back from function and not from a symbol crunching point of view of the then dominant model in cognitive science,
right,
which is the representations are symbols. And so
right,
the common enemy was this representation or symbols. But I think the tensional adder was one simple version of a functional attribution. And then you could have a more complicated mechanism where it made sense to go inside and say, you know, in binocular disparity, you might be representing disparities, right? Well, disparities aren't yet depth, right? And so then you put that together and then you get depth. Right. And that would be the patched up version of Gaukroger in this paper, right? Would be that. But I'm reading Descartes as more like a sort of behaviorist on this stuff, right? With the mind then coming in and accounting for some things like conscious experience.
Okay, so the thing that's always puzzled me is that when you had the diagram of the person pointing and the eyeballs going and the tubules and all that's in the mechanical man, right? So or actually it was a woman, I suppose.
It was a woman, that's right.
So it's always a bug. So what do you get? So that mechanical person can carry out all kinds of activities like animals do, right? What extra do you get when you put the soul back in?
Well, I guess Descartes, with here sort of unable to avoid the empirical fact, that human beings do seem to have perceptual experience. So what you get in that case, you don't get the mind actually doing anything functionally,
Right.
except realizing conscious experience of distance, right?
And that's what the brutes don't do.
That's what the brutes don't do. And we could probably then say, well, but then that could feed into other things in the mind, because then you could compare mental thing to mental thing, and maybe that's something the animals can't do.
Right.
And so then you would begin to get some functions for the mind, to play.
Right.
In this thing,
But in
beyond
terms of
simply
just
being the
plain
passive recipient of experience,
of
something that causes
perception,
experience of
right?
distance.
But as far as just plain old perceiving and acting on perceptions go, the brutes do fine without any experiences.
Yeah, anything that's, as it were, nominalistic, so where it's just individual facts of mechanism causes mechanism, then the animals could do fine. I think they wouldn't be dealing with concepts and generalizations.
So they might not be able to recognize a rabbit the second time.
Or if they did, it'd all be pattern recognition. So it wouldn't be recognized so you're saying functionally recognizing. They might functionally recognize it, but just by pattern matching. And so, we have the concept of dog that allows us to put together all kinds of dogs. I don't think by pattern matching, we would probably find it easy to do that.
So that would be something the brutes couldn't do.
Couldn't do,
yeah. Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, Stella?
Oh, sorry, I thought I was going to be a while in the back. Yeah, so I just have a bit of an informational question. So I'm only familiar with the mesolabum, or the proportional compass that you mentioned as demonstrating calculations from the geometry. And I've perhaps of the 3 essays, I've only read the geometry very carefully, and not the other ones, but you're really talking about what Descartes was doing in optics. So does the mesolabum actually come up in other places in Descartes' literature other than the geometry?
No, not that I know of. So what I was doing is saying that Descartes could have an idea of a system that gives you values that are proportionate to the mathematical values that you would expect from side angle side trigonometry. I didn't find him actually making that connection himself, but I was noticing that he has this brain state that co-varies with distance. And so I was saying, well, how could he understand that in a mechanical way? Because he seems to present it as something that can happen in a purely mechanical device. So I think, how could he understand that? I thought, what kind of device could he look upon as in an analogous fashion to allow him to make these claims that you could have this brain state that would co-vary precisely with the geometry of the triangle. And I thought, these proportional compasses. He invented a couple that were much more intricate mathematically than just doing trig, but he would certainly be aware of the Galilean type compasses. So I think, so this is how he could think about it. If you were going to say that there would be these states that are related to continuous variations in the properties of a triangle, this is how he could imagine it. And so I've gone beyond the text, but I think you have to. I think you have to articulate various ways of thinking what Descartes was on about when he was doing this, that would make sense of his claims and make sense in terms that he himself was capable of thinking about. And that Laforge, in the comments to the Treatise on Man, talks about this as a direct correlation between the triangle and the brain state in a way that doesn't need to involve any kind of mental stuff. I think so he interprets the natural geometry the way I am. I think that's a somewhat of a confirmation. And that Malebranche, in his Search After Truth, so in the early editions, he's got the mind calculating, right? And then he decides this is implausible that the mind can calculate all of this optical stuff, because he says, you know, you're seeing a meadow, you're seeing all sorts of different things in different places. How could the mind do all the calculations involved there? And so then he says, well, God does it. And that's essentially the effect of having God set up a psychophysiological law. So then I take it that Malebranche also, so I don't want to give interpretations to Descartes that I think no one in the 17th century could have understood. But I think, you know, Descartes was a really smart guy, and that, you know, Laforge and Malebranche were able to get what he was on about, at least according to this reading I'm pushing. And so then that gives me some confidence to make this kind of analogy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Very good. Evan?
Yeah, so I guess the main thing I was wondering about is if you could talk a little more about the difference between the corporeal ideas that figure in the Treatise of Man, the earlier writings, and sort of like the ideas that, you know, we're more familiar with that figure like in the Sixth Replies and sort of the later view. And I mean, in particular, one thing I've always been curious about is if the corporeal ideas are like related to the sensible species that the scholastics talk about, or just like where that notion comes from. And also, really quickly, I'm also wondering if something else the brutes can't do is perceive far distances, like at distances where accommodation and convergence become useless, and also if they can't perceive size at far distances. So,
yeah, so even how they do size is a difficulty. So let's kind of go in reverse order. So even how the brutes do size, I mean, one of the explanations of size perception that Descartes gives in the sixth discourse of the Dioptrics is that you know the distance and direction of a bunch of points. And so if you know the distance and direction, say to the rim of a coffee mug, then you know the size of the rim of the coffee mug, and you also know its shape. And so this is a strangely Walt Gogol kind of way of thinking about these things. He's a 20th century perception guy that analyzed size and shape into distance and direction. And so that would be a way for the brutes to be able to respond to size and shape at a distance. So then there's the question of what could they see very far? Well, so he recognized limits to both accommodation and convergence. I think it gives slightly different figures in the treatise and the dioptrics. And one of them he says 3 or 4 feet, and one he says 5 or 6 feet for accommodation. I think for convergence he had a little bit further, and that would be right. That's the way we'd understand it now, but not a lot further. So, you know, maybe he said 10 or 15 feet for convergence at one place. I don't quite remember at the moment. So yeah, but you know, so that would make it hard to explain falcons and eagles. But for bunny rabbits and stuff, maybe they don't need to see a lot further away than that. You know, they're just jumping around a bit. And maybe the falcons and eagles do it with some other kinds of pattern matching things. So then we go back to the corporeal ideas and how they relate. So it's interesting that you bring up scholastic species. So Descartes does call these corporeal patterns after he shifted from the treatise to the way of using ideas in the meditations. He does call them corporeal species at a couple places. And in the Cottingham and Studhoff, et cetera, they're not translated that way. They do something different with that. I forget what they do, either corporeal image or something else, but they don't say species. And so what's in common? Well, what could be in common between the two notions at the basic level that where the analogy gets started is pattern. And so ideas have structure, mental ideas have structure. You know, we'd have to go back in the history of the term idea. So Descartes partly using it in a new way, he tells us, but Now, we might also find that they have to do with structures and the mind of God in various people before. So it could be the notion of pattern that makes a kind of conceptual link. I mean, he does see himself as changing usage of the word. And he also sees himself as changing the usage from what other people do. And he's got this objective reality, which is like a pattern, at least for material things. For God and souls, objective reality might be a bit different. But he doesn't give us a lot to go on for what the objective reality of God and soul is like, except that for God, it's of an infinite being that's gives you great joy to contemplate. Yeah, so that's the best I can do at the moment for the why he would use the same word in these two different ways. And is there any kind of connection between the two ways of using it? I think, yeah. Now then, the pineal lean, called an idea of distance, is not itself a pattern. Actually, it's another kind of material covering state. So I think you'd be bootstrapping up from the notion of ideas as patterns, because he starts in saying it's the things traced on the pineal that are the ideas. And then a little bit later, he says, well, it's also the lean of the pineal. That's an idea. So it comes out, it's not just traced patterns, but it's traced patterns and other kinds of importantly covariant states. And so that's, but I think we could maybe find some common analogy in the way, having a root analogy and then extending it in certain ways that ties all these things together. Yeah.
Thanks. I believe Penn has a finger on this one. Oh, do you?
You're muted, Penn. You're muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
So I'm just going to say, since it's past 5 o'clock here, a little glass of wine I have first. Here's to Penn.
That's the kind of hospitality we can get behind. Yeah,
right.
Thanks, Gary.
The sun is over the yard arm here. So I was going to ask about the ideas, since Evan brought it up, because I've always been wondering about, well, the idea is supposed to be that pattern on the pineal, but what about the tilt? But you answered that.
I had a quick finger on this as well about the idea. So is this the idea as an object of awareness?
The idea of distance, the lean. No. So I take him seriously that what he's describing in the treatise is the body of a human being without a soul. And then every now and then he'll talk about what will happen when the soul is brought in. So when you bring the soul in, then the soul gets awareness of distance because of the effect of the lean. It doesn't get awareness of distance by perceiving the lean itself as a thing that varies in distance between the center of the brain and the forepart of the brain. No, there could be any arbitrary connection that you could make up, because you've got these psychophysiological laws, right, which allow you to pair content, and all you need is something that varies in the right way in order to be able to pair the content. So it's only once the soul has come in that you get these things as objects of awareness. Now he does use this language of turn toward. So in that very passage from the treatise, he says that the soul will turn toward, or something like that. And I think he's using the language that he can get from the scholastics, because they're talking about how you get common notions out of a variety of phantasms in the imagination. They say that the mind will turn towards. They use the same Latin word for turning towards, ad versum. Turn towards the species. And then you have a whole variety of accounts, like the active intellect together with, God will do the extraction, or something else. But in this vocabulary, and Suarez, whom we know Descartes read, uses this turn. There's this turning towards the species, which is ad versum. So he uses that in the Meditations, and actually, I could look up the French there for what he'd used there for turn toward, but I'm not going to do it at the moment. Maybe I will if we want to get really into it. So Yeah, so he sometimes speaks as if the characteristics of the brain state cause a correspondingly mental structure. So if you've got a triangle on the pineal gland in some cases, then you would experience a triangle in your mental content. But it's not always image pattern to image pattern because of this lean thing. I could say, well, the leaning is distance. And so it is analogous to distance. And so he's responding to a kind of pattern there, of distance pattern. But why is it that when it goes forward, it's nearer, when it comes back, it's further? Why wouldn't it be the other way around? So at least the material state doesn't dictate the content. You've got to have some institution of nature for doing that. But he is taking over, I think, a bit from the scholastics, the idea that, yeah, patterns in the brain might give you patterns in experience. There's this Dutch physician, Theodor Cronin, who did a Cartesian physiology, right, in the 1670s or 80s. And he's got this thing, Descartes talks about memory and images and patterns. And he says, well, the reason that sometimes images will just come to us is we've got these patterns in the brain that have that very shape. And then the spirits are always, messing around trying to find tubules to go down. And sometimes they'll get into these patterns. And then just images will arise for us, right? And so Cronin draws all these little patterns all over the inside of the brain, like a flower. He's got a flower. And he's saying, yeah, this is how Cartesian imaginational memory works, is that the spirits find these little patterns in the brain. Theodor Cronin with 2 A's. Amazing stuff.
Fascinating. Pan?
I just wanted to say, so when you hear him saying that the experience course, once you get the soul in, then the pattern on the pineal is experienced, then that's when it sounds like it's a 2-dimensional thing, right? But if you throw in the tilt, then you have that the first experience is 3-dimensional. And I think that's one of the main things that you argue elsewhere, right?
Right. I mean, you could also treat the pattern as not being 2-dimensional, but as specifying a set of directions, which is something that he invites us to do in the 6th discourse of the Dioptrics. And so if you think of the pattern on the pineal as not as giving you a 2-dimensional image that you then infer from, but as specifying a set of directions, then it becomes not so. Yeah.
But better with the tilt.
Yeah, the tilt I like.
Great. John?
Yeah, you've we're talking about visual perception of distance, right, except for the brief appearance of the blind man early on in the thing. So I'm wondering whether you could tell us something more about the connection between visual and tactile.
Yeah, it doesn't give us a lot on that. So there's in the woman, figure 53, there's the arm pointing, right? And so that's more motor action than, but in the Anstos literature, kind of, I don't know if any of you read this book by Smith, he's got it, that important thing for mapping out space is when the limb hits up against something. So Descartes might be able to say something about that. I mean, he gives us a little bit about each of the senses in the middle of the treatise, but it's just that he's more concerned with the qualities than with the spatial character of the limb. And I think the spatial character comes more in connection with this stuff with vision. So, he's got, that something's warm when it makes the particles go faster, and then he's got different things for the different tactile qualities, but very, very little. So I think mostly what it's given us is this idea of being aware of the body, and or being aware of having states in the brain that correlate with various configurations of the bodily limbs, right? So there he's got a story, and that's this story about the lean of the gland, because the lean of the gland also plays a role there. right? So if you take your finger from closer in to further out, then the gland would lean from further out to closer in, because it goes opposite. So yeah, there is some awareness that the limbs are important for our spatial awareness and interaction with things, and that the same brain states that he's gone into such detail for, in the case of the eyes, are also involved in there's similar kinds of brain states are involved in in having a brain correlate for various configurations of the bodily limbs, legs and arms, and turning the head and so forth. Yeah, that's good.
Well, what happens to the integration of the visual and the tactile into the concepts of distance that you'd be involved in physics?
Oh, I don't think that you'd get the contents that would be involved in physics without a mind, right?
Oh, you don't get that without a mind.
That's what I would guess for old Descartes. So he does say explicitly that it's the very same idea of distance controlling the accommodation of the lens, the convergence of the eyes, and the pointing of the finger, so that there's a unity, so that there is, as it were, a common sensitivity to spatial structure. To get more sophisticated things like properties of free rotation or something, which I don't think Descartes probably never thought about. I don't know what you mean by the things that physicists think about, but I assume they're beyond what Descartes would ascribe to his mindless machine.
Good. Kyle?
Thanks, and thanks for the talk, Gary. Very interesting. So my question is actually pretty flat-footed. Early on, I was confused and trying to reconcile what looked to me like a discussion among these early moderns about which of our mental processes we're consciously aware of and which ones we're not. And I was struggling to reconcile that with the broad early modern commitment to the transparency of the mental, trying to understand how those things fit together. Over the course of the talk, the picture I formed was that the way that Descartes was responding anyway on the interpretation you were advocating was to restrict the domain of the mental and put more and more things onto the, no, that's not really representation. That's not really this mental stuff that we do. But it's what things like animals do that enable them to engage with the world around them. If I'm right, if that's right about the way that Descartes would be reconciling the sort of proposal you're talking about with the commitment to something like transparency of the mental, isn't the problem that would create for him to invite a certain epiphenomenalism about our conscious states, right? I mean, the more he builds into what animals can do, that's just like us, and we've got these ideas and they're not really mental ideas, and we've got this other stuff, and no, that's not really representational, no, that's not really mental. Isn't he opening himself up to a charge of epiphenomenalism for the things that he thinks are so important?
Yeah, so ability to use language, ability to reason in a general way, ability to act from will, and having consciousness. Those are all things that humans have that you need a mind for. Now, I think what is true is that he's putting a lot of stuff. So I want to distinguish here between psychology and mental. So the psychic and the mental. There's psychological, because psychic sounds like, tarot cards or something. And so he's pushing a lot of psychology onto the mechanical side. See, and he's got to do this because he's got this animal machine hypothesis. So he has to explain their ability to behave effectively. And so he needs pretty sophisticated bodily mechanisms. And there's a place in the, I think, fourth replies where he says, well, most of what we do as humans is done by these mechanisms. And he says, so suppose you're falling over. It's not that you reason, oh, it will really hurt if I don't catch myself, and so I better put my arms out because it's going to really hurt if I get down there. He says, no, it's like a reflex. He doesn't use the word reflex, but it's like an automatic response that the machine puts out its hands because it's built that way to do that in order to protect its head. Also, you know, if you get one of your friends to come over and thrust their hand right in front of your face, you know, you'll blink.
Mhm.
And this is an example of his as well. I think it's in the Passion. But he says, look, you don't believe that the friend is going to actually poke your eye, right? It could happen, but you know, you don't believe that. So, and take the example where you definitely don't believe it. That's part of the example. But you still blink. Well, why is that? Well, because this is under the control of the brain, not the mind. So he's happy to transfer a lot of stuff into the mechanical side. But he does have those things, the ability to use language, the ability to reason, general problem solving, the will.
Which I take it just puts him in a position where he's not that worried about epiphenomenalism. He thinks he has abundant, overwhelming, you know, list of things that you couldn't do without conscious awareness that are much more complicated than perception or something like that. For what it's worth, the stuff that you were just saying about right, what he says about falling and us doing most of the same things that the animals do in the same way and all that, that all seems to me to strongly support the interpretation you want of what he's doing and the stuff you were looking at.
Yeah, and he's also got, you know, singing and walking. So he's got an account in the Treatise on Man of the reciprocal mechanical process that is involved in walking, and also involved in breathing. And then he also says, look, singing, after you learn the song, then you don't need to think about it anymore, right? He also has the extended memory stuff. He says, you know, the stuff that you remember, some of it's in books, and you just need to know where to go get the book. But then it's like a mechanical thing after that.
So on this story, this is tied with the exchange with Kyle. On this story, for things that we can't, that the brute animals can't do, like will, is the thought then that there's no physical correlate to willing something? Because if there's a physical correlate to that, then we're back to the worry of epiphenomenalism, as Kyle suggests.
Yeah, so this is an interpretive dispute both among Descartes' followers and among those Cartesian scholars today. Whether he's got the view that there's a corporeal correlate to every mental act, including willing and acts of pure intellect, or not. Now, I'm fairly sure that both Spinoza and Leibniz says that there were. So that Leibniz says that everything we do could be treated just from the mechanical side. But I think Descartes doesn't hold that. And a good number of his followers understood him not to hold that. So in my experience of the ones that I've read, the majority of the ones I've read, you know, pure understanding and willing are not things that that a machine can do, right? And so the pure understanding is this idea that you would understand without any brain process being correlated there. And this would include doing math without images. So, you know, he says this thing about geometry. And so it's a real question, what's the phenomenology of this kind of mathematical reasoning that responds to proportions and so forth, and also does geometry on objects like circles and triangles and squares, but without the imagination or the senses being involved. He's very clearly committed to that. At least I think he's very clearly committed. And if you look at the first few paragraphs of the Sixth Meditation, you know, where he does the difference between the triangle, the pentagon, and the kilogon and myrigon. You know, he says, well, look, you know, you can both imagine and understand the triangle and the pentagon, but you can't really clearly imagine the myrigon or the kilogon, but yet you can understand them just as clearly. And so he says, well, this is the pure understanding without the imagination. It turns away from the body. So that's where he also uses this turning comparison. Turns away from the body and just reasons. And then in the fifth meditation, he says, well, he clearly imagines extension, but he also says he's got these ideas that don't that are innate and don't come from the senses. And he's in his interchange with Gassendi, he's very clear that you couldn't abstract mathematical objects from material objects because you could never get to the perfection of the mathematical ideas that you have from the imperfect material models. So it seems as if, yeah, there's no bodily correlate to willing and pure understanding, but that there is to imagine, all imagining and sensing. In memory, he splits up. I don't know if it's partly because of theological pressure that you need souls after death to have some memory. Because at first he said memory is really corporeal, but then he said, well, there's a kind of intellectual memory that the soul has. That's probably a conundrum for him, and one that he didn't spend a lot of time on, but it probably is a conundrum for him. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Gary. This was really, really fun. So I have a question about the extent to which the notion of representation that you're using in posing your question is something you're attributing to Descartes, or whether it's something that you're using to ask a question of Descartes. And if this was clear at some point in the talk, I apologize. I had to leave for about 5 minutes because I had a pipe burst in the wall and there's a plumber here. But so I apologize if this is clear.
It's amazing that you're still here.
Yeah, turned out fine. There's a hole in the side of my house, but the pipe is fine now.
Okay, good.
Okay, so the final position you come to at the end is that the inclination of the pineal gland correlates with distance, but doesn't represent distance. And you have this quotation from Descartes about the way in which the painting can represent. But so is the notion of representation a sort of worked out notion from Descartes that you feel like this is his notion of representation and then I can apply it? Or are you more saying, okay, here's the best notion of representation we can come up with, and let's see whether or not what Descartes says about the pineal gland really fits that notion of representation or not? And more generally, I'm trying to figure out, so the question you're asking, is this a question that Descartes would have understood, or is it a question that we early 21st century readers of Descartes want to ask of him?
Yeah, very good. You're kind of nailing me on this. So that last part of the paper is really a response to Gaukroger's assimilating Descartes to 20th century notions as Gaukroger understood them. And so, the questions being posed by an historian of philosophy, but one who wants to understand Descartes in contemporary terms. So I'm responding on those terms. Now, in that, I'm taking bits from Descartes. So let me just say what I think is true about his theory of representation, that he doesn't have one, right? So there's bits and pieces. So in the third meditation, there's objective reality, which in the French version is objectively or by way of representation, right? And so that the word representation is used there in the French. He uses representation in the Treatise on Man one time. And he uses it in various other places. So we could say, well, let's look in Suarez and see what we can get out of that. And I'm going to read Han Thomas's Adrianson's book for my seminar this spring, and I hope there to get more enlightened about Descartes' relation to the medieval background, which I've looked into to some extent, but not so far, because the medievals also talk about representations. That was always the claim, is that they were following Aristotle and they didn't need representations because they were direct realists. But if you look in Aquinas, if you look in Suarez, you find representation all over the place. So here I'm not trying to make great strides in interpreting Descartes' few mentions of representation and try to make something coherent come out of them. But I'm trying to position him in relation to distinctions that I believe people in the 17th century could have made, and that relate what we're saying about Descartes to more recent concepts. So I don't consider that to be illegitimate, but I think you have to be clear what you're doing. Maybe I wasn't clear enough which I was doing. And even if you're trying to relate Descartes to more recent concepts, it's still Descartes that you're trying to relate, not some figure that you make up and then attribute these ideas without any basis whatsoever. So I think I'm sort of trying to play both sides there a bit in that last third of the paper, or fourth, whatever it is, on this concept of representation. And I think part of it is because there's Descartes doesn't say, here's my theory of representation, right? He gives us this objective reality stuff. He uses the word here and there every now and then. Clearly thinks that, he does effectively say that in some places that color is a confused representation of the external world. And then other places he'll say that color doesn't represent at all. These passages in the Principles, and then I read those in a certain way, that he's making a developmental point that when the child is in the womb and experiences color because the animal spirits are flowing around in the brain there, that at that point it doesn't represent anything in the world. Because he tells us just in the next principle that, well, what's really going on here is that when we say we perceive color, is that we perceive something in the surface whose nature we don't really know about, but that's what we're perceiving. So I take that to be that what backs up his claims that these secondary qualities are confused ideas, and then if we take it to be idea in the sense of having objective reality, and then make the transition from objective reality to representation, then the color sensations are confused representations, and that's a way to interpret Descartes there, right? And so when I did that comparison between his theory of color perception, I was staying just within Descartes and within the 17th century. But yeah, I guess I'm sliding around here a bit without making clear when I'm situating him in relation to more recent thought, and which I consider to be not a good thing to do. You should always be clear which you're doing, but you can also do these hybrid things where you show these relations that maybe help illuminate what Descartes was thinking, even though they use words in ways that he didn't.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Alicia?
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. It was really great. I guess I was just wondering a little bit about like clarificatory question, I guess, like how your interpretation of Descartes kind of contrasts with your interpretation of Berkeley. So on your reading of Berkeley, as I recall, distance is the immediate object of vision that we can see. But for Descartes, you think that we don't actually see distance, correct? Like Descartes doesn't have this kind of view of this two-stage process that utilizes something like a sensory core, similar to how Berkeley did. Is that right?
Well, I'm a moving target on this, I think, because I wrote this paper, I guess 40 years ago now, on the sensory core, in which I said Descartes did have a sensory core.
Okay.
And that's why Penn was pushing me on this question of whether he's got the two-dimensional thing from the pattern on the pineal gland, which would be a sensory core. And I guess I believe there's some kind of sensory core in Descartes. And he's also a little bit of a moving target. So it could be that he thought, well, there's this two-dimensional thing, but then you can get, if you treat it as directions, then you've also got direct seeing of distance, and that stretches it out. So I think Descartes in this stuff in the treatise comes up with the notion of direct perception of distance. So not inferred, not done on the basis of habit, but that you see distance. And in the sixth discourse of the Dioptrics, he actually uses that very word, you see distance. And so I think he's got direct seeing of distance in this more sophisticated stuff of the Dioptrics and the Treatise on Man. In the 6 objections and replies, he's got the 3 stages of sense, 3 grades of sense, and he's writes as if the 2nd grade is 2-dimensional, but maybe he should include in it some 2-dimensional aspect and some direct perception of distance. Except he couldn't have done that in the 6 replies because nobody would have known what he was talking about because the treatise hadn't been published. What he'd done in the dioptrics was, very, very small, and I think is able to be magnified using the treatise to look back. Now, Berkeley, I take it, does have a 2-dimensional sensory core that's visual. And when he says we see distance and size, and he means by that tactile distance and size, the distances and sizes that things have when measured with a ruler and stuff, I think Berkeley's taking that's always a mediated act, a mediated act. It's always mediated by associative learning with, in the new theory of vision, he says inference, but then in the theory of vision vindicated and explained, he says, well, we should really always treat this as association or suggestion. So, and he distinguishes judgment from suggestion. So I think those are competing in the new theory, and he settles in the theory of vision vindicated and explained. So let's just say he's got a suggestion view. So it's that you've got this vision thing where the visible magnitude, if you take an object and you bring it closer or further away, the visible magnitude is just changing. And you've got the visible figure. So then the visible figure is whatever the shape is there that you've got. And then, those are immediate objects of sight. And then by correlation with suggestion, you get to where you now experience the hand as being of the same size, but coming closer or further away. And then that's the immediate object of vision as a result of association. And you do that for both shape and size. So that's the way I'm thinking of Berkeley. I'm thinking of him as a much more rabid sensory core guy, and as much more, keeping a clear distinction between the space of vision and the space of touch. And the space what we phenomenally have through vision, I think, for Berkeley, for the mature person, is a space where the spatial content has come from touch, and then the colors clothe the things and so forth. So there's a mixture of touch and vision. But yeah. So that's a good question. Nails me on my former self.
Very good. Penn, do you have any final thoughts or reflections you'll have to unmute.
Sorry. Yeah, I did kind of want to follow up on that. So if we think that we see distance, for Berkeley, that's an illusion?
It would only be an illusion if you thought that what we really see is the immediate object. And there are people who think that. I don't have any evidence that Berkeley thinks that the immediate object is what we really see in this broad sense of see, where there's both immediate and mediate objects. So if you've got both immediate and mediate objects of sight, and I think those opening articles of the new theory say that, because they say this is how we see distance. Then it's what you get is a difference from the proper object of sight. But I don't think that every difference from the proper object of sight is defined by Berkeley as a kind of illusion.
Okay, so we really do see distance.
Yeah, I think it's my reading of Berkeley that we really do see distance.
Yeah, good.
We just see it as immediate. It's immediate object.
Got it. Good.
But phenomenally, it's just present to us as the thing is at a distance.
Good. Thank goodness.
Otherwise, we trip over
Margaret
stuff.
disagrees. So
What's that?
Margaret Atherton disagrees.
She does. She does. Well, and Philip and
Bob agrees.
Bob thinks Berkeley's right about everything, but George Pitcher also thinks is with Margaret Atherton on that, right?
As I recall, that was a long time ago.
Yeah. This is Evan's backyard.
Uh-huh.
I actually thought both. I thought both Atherton and Schwartz think that we can't, that there's no phenomenal experience of distance at all for Berkeley. So
Oh,
I might be wrong about Schwartz, though. I don't know.
yeah, it was Schwartz that Gary, you thought he did have phenomenal experience of distance.
I did.
Yeah, I
do
thought
think
so
that.
too, but
Yeah.
we'll have to look back.
It's an empirical
Okay.
matter.
Hmm?
It's an empirical matter,
It is. It is.
although it's an interpretive matter as well. So then it becomes very complicated to evaluate the empirical evidence.
Right. That's it, Jeff.
Thank you all the way around for joining in with the deliberations and reflections together. This is a fantastic way to end the week. One quick thought, and before we thank Gary and go our separate ways. One thing that occurs to me, there are a bunch of downsides to our current situation, but there are some advantages too. And it's been great to see the far-flung colleagues who might not be able to join us on a typical Friday. Thank you very much for joining us and for helping out. We have a number of talks that remaining in the series. Those can be found online. And so please feel free to join us going into the future. And with that, I would like to thank Gary for leading us in this fascinating topic. Thanks a lot.
Well, it was my pleasure. And I want to thank the organizers for having thought that I would be a good person to ask. And I want to thank Penn for all these years of interchange that we've had, and just say how much I respect and admire her, and how I so much enjoyed the discussions that we were able to have when I visited. And so, yeah, so again, here's to Penn.
Thank you.
Here's to all of you guys who are her colleagues and faculty colleagues and student colleagues, and who also, at least a good many of you, share her interests in perception and the history of theories of perception and things that I share with her as well.
Good.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. Best weekend wishes to everyone. Stay safe, and our paths will cross again soon.
Yes.